I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a single door. That's the part nobody ever believes when I tell this story. They expect me to say I finally snapped, that I threw something across the room or said something I'd regret. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways that made it worse. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but I'm 63 years old, retired from 28 years in commercial construction management, and I have a house in Naperville, Illinois that I paid off 7 years before I ever met my wife. I want you to hold on to that detail. It matters later. I married Sandra 11 years ago. She was 51, recently divorced, warm in a way that made a room feel smaller in the best possible sense. We met through mutual friends at a 4th of July cookout, and by October we were inseparable. I knew going in that she had a daughter, Brianna, 20 years old at the time, living in a dorm at Northern Illinois University, studying something in communications. Sandra talked about her with that particular mix of pride and worry that only mothers seem to carry. I thought I understood what I was walking into. What I didn't fully understand, what I told myself wasn't a problem, for years longer than I should have, was that Brianna had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was a temporary inconvenience in her mother's life, not a threat, not someone to fight, just someone to wait out. She was polite enough in those early years. Holidays were fine. She called Sandra every few days, came home for breaks, borrowed Sandra's car when she was visiting. She didn't talk to me much, but I figured that was normal. I was the new man. I gave it time. I kept giving it time. Sandra and I got married in a small ceremony in June, 2 years after we started dating. Brianna was there. She wore a yellow dress and smiled for every photograph. I remember thinking, standing at the front of that outdoor pavilion we'd rented in Geneva, watching Sandra walk toward me, that everything was going to work out. That families blend, eventually. That patience is its own kind of love. Brianna graduated the following spring. Sandra and I drove up to DeKalb for the ceremony, sat in those uncomfortable folding chairs for 3 hours in the May heat, took her to dinner after at a steakhouse she chose. I paid, gladly. She was 23 and she was my wife's daughter, and I wanted things to be good between us. She moved back home that summer. Just for a few months, she said, while she figured out her next steps. Sandra thought it would be good for them to have some time together. I agreed. I cleared out the guest room, bought a new dresser from IKEA, put a small television in there, made it comfortable. A few months became a year. A year became 3. Brianna got a job at a marketing agency in downtown Chicago, took the metro in every day, came home most evenings and went straight to her room. She paid no rent. She contributed nothing to groceries. She used the washer and dryer daily, left dishes in the sink, had friends over on weekends without asking. When I mentioned, carefully, diplomatically, that it might be time to think about her own place, Sandra would get quiet in that way. That meant the conversation was over. I kept going. I told myself it was fine. She was saving money. Young people have it hard these days. The housing market is brutal. I knew all the arguments because I'd made them to myself so many times they'd worn grooves. What I hadn't fully accounted for was the way Brianna looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something more like appraisal, like she was calculating something. I started to notice it around year 4 of her living with us. Little things. She would walk into a room where Sandra and I were talking, and Sandra would shift her attention immediately, completely, the way a plant turns toward a window. I didn't begrudge Sandra her love for her daughter, but there was something about the dynamic that had started to feel like I was a guest in my own house. A guest who paid the mortgage, the property taxes, the utility bills, the grocery runs to Jewel Osco every Sunday, but a guest nonetheless. The summer before everything changed, Brianna's boyfriend moved in. His name was Kyle. He was 29, worked remotely for some tech startup, kept irregular hours, and had an opinion about everything. He arrived with 4 boxes of belongings and the desktop computer set up. and was apparently under the impression that the guest room had become a long-term studio apartment. Sandra said it was just until he found a place. I asked how long that might take. She said she wasn't sure. Kyle didn't dislike me. That would have been easier to navigate. He just treated the house like a shared amenity. He ate my food, used my grill on the back patio without asking, left his car in my spot in the driveway twice. When I mentioned the parking situation, he apologized once and did it again 3 weeks later. I started keeping a list, not out of any particular plan, just to hold on to my own sanity. A running note in my phone of things that had happened, dates, what was said. I don't know why I started doing that. Some instinct, maybe. Some part of me that understood even before the rest of me was ready to accept it, that things were moving toward something. Thanksgiving that year was the first real crack. Sandra's sister flew in from Phoenix. Her brother drove up from Bloomington with his wife and 2 kids. We had 14 people in that house, and I'd been cooking since Tuesday. I made the turkey, the green bean casserole, the mashed potatoes, a sweet potato dish Sandra's mother used to make that I'd learned specifically because it mattered to Sandra. I'd spent close to $400 on groceries. I'd cleaned the house top to bottom. We were all sitting around the table, that particular lull after the food was served, when everyone's filling their plates and the conversation is light. Sandra's brother made a toast. Said something kind about the house, about how good it was to be together. And Brianna said, laughing like it was nothing, like she was making small talk, she said, "It's a great house. I've always said someday it'll be mine anyway." The table went quiet for maybe 2 seconds. Then someone laughed, and the conversation moved on, and the moment dissolved the way those moments do in family settings, absorbed into the noise and the passing of dishes. But I heard it. Sandra heard it. Sandra looked at me for just a fraction of a second before looking away. I finished my plate. I helped clear the dishes. I was pleasant all evening. When everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and I thought about that sentence for a long time. Someday, it'll be mine anyway. Not, I hope to have a place like this someday. Not, I love this house, mine. Anyway, like it was a foregone conclusion. Like I was a variable that would eventually resolve itself. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, while Sandra was driving her sister to O'Hare, I made a phone call. I had a lawyer I'd worked with on some property matters years earlier. A sharp woman named. Well, it doesn't matter what her name was. I called her office and left a message asking for a consultation. Just to understand my options. Just to know what the landscape looked like. We met the following week. I explained the situation. She explained what I already suspected, but hadn't fully confronted. That because Sandra and I had no prenuptial agreement and had been married for nearly a decade, and because Sandra had been contributing financially to household expenses in ways that could be documented, the house I had owned outright before our marriage existed in a complicated space, legally speaking. Not automatically hers, but not automatically clean either in certain scenarios. I drove home from that meeting feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Clarity. I didn't say anything to Sandra right away. Christmas came. It was fine. Kyle got Brianna an engagement ring, which Sandra cried over with joy. There was talk of a wedding the following fall, which meant, presumably, Kyle would become a more permanent fixture. More of the same, formalized. January was quiet. February, I started making changes. I refinanced the house under specific terms that my lawyer had advised. I updated my will. I documented what I owned, what I'd paid for, what predated the marriage. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was just putting my affairs in order in the way a man in his 60s should probably have done years earlier. The thing that finally broke the surface happened in March. It was a Saturday afternoon. Sandra was at her book club. I was in the garage doing some organizing, which is something I do when I need to think. Brianna came out to get something from the recycling bin, and on her way back in, she stopped. Leaned against the doorframe. I thought she was going to ask me something practical. What she said was, "You know she's going to want to keep the house if things ever go sideways between you two, right? Just so you know where things stand." I set down the box I was holding. I looked at her. She had her arms crossed, not aggressively, just casually, like she was telling me the forecast. I said, "What makes you think things are going sideways?" She shrugged. "They always do, eventually." Then she went inside. I stood in that garage for probably 10 minutes. My hands were steady. My heart rate was normal. That was the part that surprised me most. How calm I felt. Not numb. Calm. Like something had been decided, even though I hadn't decided anything yet. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and I wrote down, in plain language, what the last several years had actually looked like. Not emotionally. Practically. What I had provided. What I had asked for in return. What I had received. The numbers were stark. Since Brianna had moved in, I had effectively been subsidizing her life to the tune of somewhere between $1,800 and $2,000 a month when you factored in her share of the mortgage equivalent, utilities, food, and incidentals. Over 4.5 years, that was close to $100,000. Kyle had been there 9 months. Add his presence in, conservatively, and the number climbed. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I want to be clear about that. I had made choices. Every month I'd let go without having the real conversation was a choice I made. You can't spend years enabling something and then act like a victim when you finally look at the bill. I knew that. I'd even heard something like it from Sandra once in a different context, and I'd agreed with her. Now I was agreeing with myself. When Sandra came home that evening, I asked her to sit down. I told her about the conversation in the garage. I told her calmly, without editorializing. She listened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said Brianna didn't mean it the way it sounded, that she was just being her usual blunt self, that I was reading into it. I said I didn't think I was. She said I'd never really given Brianna a fair chance. That was the moment. Not the garage. Not Thanksgiving. That moment, sitting at our kitchen table under the light I'd installed myself 8 years ago, when Sandra looked at me and chose the story that was easier for her to hold. I didn't argue. I said okay. I said okay. I said I heard her. I said I was going to sleep and we could talk more if she wanted. I didn't sleep in the bedroom that night. I slept in the guest room, the other one, the one nobody was using. I lay there on the narrow mattress looking at the ceiling, and I thought about who I was before I got so good at letting things pass. In the morning I called my daughter from my first marriage. She lives in Colorado now, has her own family. We kept in close touch over the years. I told her I might be coming to visit. She said come whenever. She didn't ask a lot of questions. That's one of the things I've always loved about her. I booked a flight for the following weekend. Round trip technically, but I only packed for one way. I didn't tell Sandra I was leaving until Friday evening. I kept it simple. I said I needed some time to think and that I was going to Colorado for a while. I said nothing in the house would change while I was gone. Bills would be paid. Nothing would be disrupted. She looked at me for a long time. Then she asked if this was about Brianna. I said it was about a lot of things that had been accumulating for a long time. She asked when I was coming back. I said I wasn't sure. That was the truth. I left early Saturday morning. The house was quiet. I put my bag in the car, walked back inside, and left an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a letter I'd spent 3 evenings writing and rewriting. It was not an angry letter. It was a clear one. It said what I had provided over the years. It said what I had needed and not received. It said what I expected if I was going to come home, that Brianna and Kyle would have 60 days to find their own place, that we would begin seeing a couples counselor, and that I wanted Sandra to acknowledge, not to me, but to her daughter, that what had been said in the garage and at Thanksgiving was not acceptable. I also included a document my lawyer had drafted. It wasn't divorce papers. It was a proposed cohabitation and property agreement, something that should have existed years earlier, that would clarify the financial arrangement going forward. It was not punitive. It was just honest. I set the envelope next to her coffee mug so she'd see it first thing. Then I drove to O'Hare and got on a plane. My daughter picked me up in Denver and we drove back to her place in Fort Collins without talking much. The mountains were visible from the highway, white-capped, enormous and indifferent. I watched them through the window and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space, just space. Sandra called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. She called again that evening, and I picked up. She had read the letter. She was not screaming, but her voice had that particular tight quality that's almost worse. She said she couldn't believe I'd done this. She said I was blowing everything out of proportion. I said I didn't think I was. There was a long silence. She said Brianna was crying. I said I was sorry she was upset. I meant it. She asked if I was filing for divorce. I said not yet. That I wanted to see if we could find our way to something real, but that I couldn't keep living the way we'd been living. Another silence. She said quietly that she hadn't known I was this unhappy. I thought about that for a moment. I said I hadn't been sure how to tell her in a way she could hear. We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. It wasn't a resolution. It was more like a ceasefire. She said she needed time to think. I said I had time. I told her I'd loved her, and I meant that too. I spent 2 weeks in Fort Collins. My daughter and I went hiking twice. I helped her repaint her living room. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in what felt like years. I ate breakfast slowly, without the radio on, watching the birds at the feeder she'd hung outside the kitchen window. Sandra and I talked every 2 or 3 days. The conversations shifted gradually, from defensive to something more honest. She admitted in one of those calls that she had known things were off, but hadn't wanted to look at it directly. She said she was afraid of what it would mean to make Brianna leave, that she'd spent so much of Brianna's childhood feeling guilty about the divorce that she'd overcorrected in ways she was only now seeing clearly. That took courage to say. I told her so. Brianna called me once. I was surprised to see her name on my phone. The call was short, and it wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. She said she hadn't meant for things to get to this point. I said I knew that. I said I hoped she and Kyle found a good place. I meant that too. Sandra found them a rental in Carroll Stream through a co-worker's connection. 2-bedroom, reasonable rent for the area. Brianna and Kyle moved in on the 1st of May. Sandra told me about it the evening it happened. She said the house felt different. I asked her if it felt bad. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, honestly, no. That it felt like she could breathe. I flew home the second weekend of May. Sandra picked me up from the airport. We hugged in the arrivals lane outside Terminal 2, and neither of us said anything for a while. The envelope was still on the counter when we got home. She'd left it there, she said, to remind herself of what was real. We started with the couples counselor the following week, a man in Wheaton with a calm office and a direct manner. We've been going for several months now. It's not easy. Some of those sessions are the hardest conversations I've ever sat through, but we sit through them. The property agreement Sandra signed, without argument, in the end. I think she understood that it wasn't about distrust. It was about clarity, about both of us knowing what was real and what we were actually choosing, instead of just drifting in the same direction and hoping it was the right one. I still sit at that kitchen table some mornings with my coffee before Sandra is up, looking at the backyard, the oak tree I planted 10 years ago that's finally tall enough to give real shade. I think about the years I spent in that house quietly absorbing things that were never okay, telling myself it was patience, when sometimes it was just avoidance. I don't regret the marriage. I don't even regret most of the years. What I regret is the voice I kept turning down in myself, the one that knew what was happening and waited too long to say it out loud. A man can give a lot out of love. He can give time and money and space in his home and years of steady, quiet effort. But there has to be a floor, some solid ground he will not let be taken from him, not out of hardness, out of respect, for himself first and then for everyone else. I know where my floor is now. That's the thing I left on that kitchen table. Not just a letter, not just a legal document. The truth of where I stood, finally said out loud to the people who needed to hear it. It took me longer than it should have, but I got there. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not just the Thanksgiving comment, not just the garage conversation, but all of it. The slow accumulation of years where I told myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the family together. It wasn't. I know that now in a way I can't unknow. Here's what I've come to understand about how things unfold between people. What you allow, consistently, without correction, becomes the new normal. Not because people are cruel by nature, but because human beings, all of us, adjust to whatever floor we're given. Brianna didn't wake up one morning and decide to be entitled. She was handed a situation, year after year, where there were no real consequences for taking more than she gave. I built that floor. I kept it level for her. And then I was surprised when she stood on it comfortably. That's not blame. That's just honesty about cause and effect. What Sandra said to me, that she hadn't known I was this unhappy, stayed with me for a long time. I believed her, and that made it harder, not easier, because it meant that all those years of quiet absorption, all that careful not rocking the boat, had communicated exactly the wrong thing. I thought I was being patient. What I was actually doing was making myself invisible, and you cannot expect people to value what they cannot see. The intelligence in any long relationship isn't in avoiding hard conversations. It's in having them early enough that they don't become emergencies. I failed that test for a decade. I waited until the truth had so much pressure behind it that it came out not as a conversation, but as an envelope on a table and a flight to Colorado. That's not wisdom. That's a man who ran out of road. But here's what I'll say in my own defense, and I mean it plainly. I got there. Late, yes, later than I should have. But I stopped. I looked at what was real. I found a lawyer. I wrote that letter. I said the thing out loud that I'd been swallowing for years. There is something in a person, I don't know what to call it exactly, some stubborn core that knows when enough is enough, even when the rest of you is still negotiating. I listened to that part of myself, finally. It took courage I didn't know I still had. And Sandra, I want to say something true about her, because this story isn't about a villain. She was a mother who overcorrected out of guilt. She was a woman who loved her daughter so much that she couldn't see clearly what that love was costing both of them. When she finally said on one of those phone calls from Fort Collins that she thought she'd been giving Brianna permission to stay small, that was one of the bravest things I've ever heard anyone say about themselves. That kind of honesty doesn't come easy. It takes something real in a person to look at their own choices without flinching. That's what I want to leave you with, not a tidy resolution, because life doesn't really offer those. What it offers is the chance at any point to be more honest than you were the day before, to stop absorbing what isn't yours to carry, to put the real thing on the table instead of a polite version of it, to know clearly without anger where you stand and say so. The oak tree in my backyard is tall enough now to give real shade. I planted it the year I moved into that house before any of this. Some mornings I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee and I look at it and I think about time, about how long things take to grow into what they were always going to be. I'm still here, still figuring it out. That's enough.